So this seminar is actually the fourth in a series of webinars, which Africarix has been has scheduled in 2021 to discuss a very key topic for Africa: the development of innovation and the innovation and development field in Africa, and discussing how can that be improved in the future. This has been the topic since we began this webinar series in February this year. Today's webinar is informed by the understanding that skills for innovation in Africa are critical. And I think for most of us who are innovation scholars, we understand this to perhaps refer to competences, whether soft or hard competences. So this is very critical for Africa. But there is a challenge that relates to the brain drain, which is kind of real, and not just for Africa, but also for other emerging economies. So this particular discussion we are going to be having today, the main aim is to present a comprehensive review of the challenges and opportunities that rest on the role of high-skilled African migrants in the African science, technology, and innovation systems. To help us to deliberate on this topic, we do have two speakers today. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Gussai, who is a researcher at STIPRO. And maybe many of you who are joining us, they know STIPRO, which is based in Tanzania. He has a background in engineering, policy, and development, but his main research interests are technological change, sustainable design, industrial policy, and engineering education in Africa. He's going to help us to deliberate on this particular topic today as the keynote speaker. We do have a discussant who is going to respond to what he's going to be sharing. Dr. Agnes Lutomiah. She is a research fellow at African Center for Technology Studies. You may all know that Africarix is housed at ACTS in Nairobi, and this is where Agnes is based. Agnes is working on within a project, a program, Science Granting Council funded program, which is looking at use of evidence in policy and decision making in Africa. But she has a PhD in science, technology, and STS, Science Technology Studies, from CREST in South Africa. Her research focused on a scientific production of scientists in a key African system, which is Kenya, science system in Kenya. But she has interest in higher education, particularly in Africa, as well as other issues around STI research and performance. So for today, Gussai is going to kind of set the scene by sharing his research experience on skills for innovation, highly skilled African migrants, and the challenges of brain drain, based on a book chapter that is going to be coming up soon. And Agnes is going to respond to his presentation, but she's also going to bring in her experience working on science systems in Africa. This will actually be followed by the usual plenary discussion, which is going to be open to the audience with the question and answer session. So I would encourage during the first 1 hour when they will be having the presentation, that anybody with a comment, anybody with a question, you can post that, using the chat function. So that when we get into the discussion, we'll be having quite some engagement going on already. We do have some questions which were sent before before the webinar, and we are very appreciative to those people who are able to do that. And we are going to be looking at that. So without much ado, and having welcomed everybody, make sure that you keep your mics, muted so that we can have an engagement without a disruption. So offer to you, Gussai, to take us through the next 25 minutes. Then from there, we will have Agnes take over the next 15 minutes. Over to you.
Okay, greetings to everyone. And I hope that today's presentation will be useful and fruitful. So the title of the presentation is Skills for Innovation, Highly Skilled African Migrants and the Challenges of Brain Drain. It is based on a book chapter. Yeah, Moses, can you move to the next slide, please? With a similar name, Skills for Science Systems in Africa, the Case of Brain Drain. It is written or authored by two authors. That's myself and Dr. Amir Ahmed from the American University in Cairo. And that book chapter should be coming up soon in the edited book with the name of the title of Building Science Systems in Africa, Conceptual Foundations and Empirical Considerations, published by the African Center for Technology Studies, Express, and also from Dar es Salaam, Cook and Aniota Publishers. The outline for this presentation, we'll start with an introduction. This is the introduction. Then we'll talk about brain drain and beyond. We'll talk about the scope and consequences of the size of highly skilled African migrants in the diaspora. And we'll talk about how the world responds to brain drain, because it's a global issue, as Anne just mentioned. And then we'll wrap up with conclusions and recommendations. Next slide. When it comes to Africa, when we talk about the diaspora, the African diaspora, the recent African diaspora, we have to connect history. And that's when we talk about two boats. There is the first boat, was like 12.5 million Africans were shipped from Africa to the New World during the transatlantic slave trade. Known in the literature as the African diaspora. That's the first African diaspora. And we're mentioning it because it targeted mainly young and able-bodied Africans to produce physical labor. And that disrupted the lives and the historical process of African communities. And that affected severely the human resources in the continent. Not just the natural resources. And by default, that also contributed to what we call today the underdevelopment of Africa. But now we are talking about the second boat. So in terms of the African diaspora, we have the first boat and then we have the second boat. Now the second boat has been quite large before 2015. And by 2050, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa in the OECD countries could increase from 7 million in 2013 to about 35 million, according to the IMF in 2016. The second boat is characterized by massive skilled labor migration from developing countries to developed and industrialized countries. And here we're talking particularly about Africa, but it's actually a global issue. And this kind of massive skilled labor migration applies continuous pressure on local human resources capacities for development. Would like to mention though that migration in general in our modern world often results in some positive correlations in various sectors of human knowledge and financial flow from back to home countries. So we're not talking today about, speaking about skilled labor migration in just a negative light. We're just talking about the challenges more particularly, and then some opportunities. However, the phenomenon itself indeed has some positive aspects. However, negative impacts today, particularly for Africans, outweigh positive ones. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of educating a medical doctor on average is $66,000, a nurse $43,000. So, and the opportunity cost per migrant is between 346,000 and 238,000. Now, these amounts far exceed remittances sent back to African countries by skilled migrants. And that's, I know this point usually comes out, you know, when we talk about how we lose skilled migrants, but we also benefit from remittances that come. Now, because of that, Africa loses $200 billion annually, which twice what it gets in aid. So it outweighs the benefits. Next slide. So brain drain, as known in the literature, is the phenomenon of massive skilled labor migration from developing countries to developed industrialized countries. That's the definition, or the general definition of brain drain. Major factors that contribute to brain drain in Africa have been basically named as first globalization, which is of course a global phenomenon, and there is also the failed developmental model that was tried and experimented with many times in many countries in Africa. Three, basically, is the immigration and refugee policies in the developed North. That's one major factor, which resulted generally that since 1990, at least 20,000 qualified people left Africa every year. So the concept of brain drain emerged in the 1950s, and was first used by the British Royal Society to describe a situation in the 1950s. So that was quite early on. However, it is still useful today in drawing the attention to the adverse impacts of the flow of skilled talents. Next slide. Yet we approach the concept of brain drain with a critical eye. And with that, we identify about 4 problems with that concept. First, that it regards the sending country as a passively static locale. So it fails to recognize that migration as a process and migrants are also carriers of social capital, and that they have a role and there are conditions of the receiving countries and the agency of the migrant themselves. So the migrants themselves have an agency in the process. Second, the concept identifies migration as a major problem for economic development for poorer countries. So it only talks about poorer countries. And brain drain, however, has a more global impact, which we will try to mention also briefly, and we mention it with more detail in the chapter that we mentioned. But basically, this massive flow of skilled labor from developing countries to developed countries has been contributing positively and evidently to the continuous process of technological advancement and economic development of the industrialized countries. So it is beneficial with numbers objectively to industrialized countries. The third problem with the concept of brain drain is that it diminishes the loss solely to migrants in the tertiary education category and above, with little attention paid to younger age migrants, as well as second generation migrants. which is, there is a name for it as well, as called brain waste, which is basically people who are highly skilled that end up working in jobs that do not utilize their full skills, but they answer to particular economic aspirations of these migrants that they wouldn't have had in their home countries. The fourth problem is that it underestimates the knowledge and expertise acquired by migrants abroad, which in some cases might have not been possible without the migration journey. So there is, what I mentioned earlier is that there is a level of acquiring knowledge and acquiring expertise that the concept of brain drain does not give it justice. And so, given all these problems with the concept, although we are using it today, there are additional and complementary concepts that we use within the chapter, and we also propagate or hope to basically promote in addressing the problem in general, such as brain gain, brain exchange, brain circulation, brain transfer, and so on. Each of these terms have a particular use, or more or less a use that can be much better than the use of brain drain in some cases. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the scope and consequences of what we're mentioning, and why we're saying there is generally a negative impact currently as we speak. On the education front, African PhD holders outside Africa outnumber those inside it. And this is a problem because when we talk about brain drain coming from other parts of the world, it is very hard to find that PhD holders outside the country outnumber the ones inside. But in Africa, that's the case. And that's like when we talk about the whole continent in general. And some countries have a bigger problem than others, as we will see. And this results in a shortage of teachers and instructors, especially in high education institutes. So African researchers are pressured with time in ways that have clear impact on their research productivity. So the class size in African universities, for example, is generally higher or generally bigger because we have less professors within the country. And that applies pressure on these African professors and African instructors to not have enough time to do their research. And so their research productivity is impacted by that. They produce less papers and all that stuff, and some of the things that already are known to us. Also, 80% of African researchers indicated in a recent research that was published in 2018 that they have considered leaving the country or leaving Africa in general. As we mentioned earlier, since 1990, at least 20,000 qualified researchers left Africa every year. On the health front, there is a huge disparity in the ratio of health professionals. The WHO advises developing countries to have at least one physician per 5,000 patients. And that's basically talking about the population in general. While in some cases, like in Nigeria, the ratio is 1 to 41,000. In Liberia, you have one pharmacist for every 85,000 people. And in Ethiopia, there are 900 doctors, only 900 doctors in a country of 100 million. That's according to the research that was the reference that we took when we wrote that chapter. Additionally, 3,000 Ethiopian doctors work overseas, and we have more Ethiopian trained doctors, not just Ethiopian doctors, but Ethiopian trained doctors who practice the profession in Chicago alone than in the entire country of Ethiopia. On the STI and R&D front, we have a significant shortage of engineering skills all over the continent. We're talking about engineers, technologists, and technicians. For example, in 2013, it was reported that in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, there is on average one qualified engineer for a population of 6,000 people, compared to 1 engineer per 200 people in China. And in other countries, like in the UK and stuff, the number is a little more than 200, but very far from 6,000. Next slide. So this is the impact. We spoke about the scope and consequences. We give these numbers so that people can understand why it is a problem, in addition to the economic issue that we mentioned earlier. So how the world responds to brain drain. The collective experience of many countries within and outside Africa to deal with brain drain, which is an issue that they have actually tried to deal with since the 1980s and still going on. It resulted in what is called the 6 Rs. And it's more like an abstraction of a myriad of approaches that in 2001, authors commissioned by the ILO, International Labour Organization, came up with this approach, or kind of try to summarize how the world responds to brain drain by making a simple concept that can be remembered. So they call it the 6 Rs. And it stands for 3 approaches, or 6 approaches that all start with R. I listed them here in this slide. They basically return, restriction, recruitment, reparation, resourcing, and retention. In terms of return, which is the focus of most policies, is try to get most of the African highly skilled migrants to hopefully retain, or to have at least partially, or some relevance, return to be productive and working within the continent. There are many policies that encourage and help with that. We mentioned some of them in the chapter. There is also the restriction of international mobility, which is the less favored, in terms of freedom of movement and all of that. But there are some measures that, or policies that do not sound as bad as restriction, so to speak, but they also help kind of halt or slow down the flow of migration. So it can be explicit, or they can be also in terms of national trades and stuff. There is also the recruitment of international migrants. So with tax incentives, simplified visa regimes, we make an effort nationally to recruit some of our skilled migrants who are working outside the country or the continent, and basically attract them with opportunities of work. So that's recruitment. There is also reparation for loss of human capital, and this is mostly done at the level of country to country, bilateral or sometimes multilateral, but it's designed to deal with the externalities created by immediate loss of human capital. And we mentioned some of that earlier. So there is a huge cost in training a doctor or an engineer or a nurse or a researcher or a scientist that the country invests in. And when that highly skilled person leaves the country immediately, or just after a few years from graduating or from becoming productive, it has an impact, and it is productive, and that person becomes productive in the country that they go to. So there should be some consideration for that, and some level of reparation. And there are some experiments with that. There is also resourcing of expatriates. So that's a significant resource. Like if there is an ongoing contact between academic and private sector institutions, if we can foster that, as well as governments and private sector initiatives that seek to increase communication, knowledge transfer, remittances, and investment. So we talk about remittances here as something that is really investing in the development of the country. And we also talk about it in the sense that there are times when researchers, like, let me give an example. Indian and Chinese researchers, and also Korean researchers who are located and based in the OECD countries and universities or research institutes, they are migrants. However, when you see that many publications that come out in collaboration between Chinese researchers in Chinese universities and scholars in the US, you will actually find out that many of these scholars in the US are Chinese immigrants. While when you, and the same thing for India, the same thing for Korea, when you do that comparison for African scholars, you find that that is not usually the case. Local African scholars, when they collaborate with scholars and researchers in the North, usually they're not African migrants. Of course, that's not the case all the time, but in the majority of such publications, are not co-authored by African migrants and Africans at home. So we can learn something from the Chinese, the Koreans, and in that aspect, and it will be to the benefit of all. The second, the last approach is retention, and it's more broad, I would say, and it can take two approaches: through education sector policies and through economic development. So through the education sector policies, we can create highly educated workforce, and that begins with strengthening domestic education institutions to make leaving that education institution a bad option. And that kind of happened actually before. So if you look at the 1970s and 1980s, African scholars who are hired in African universities are not. So in the 1970s, 1980s, and even up to the 1990s, African scholars who were able to secure positions in African universities, big African universities, University of Kenya, University of Dar es Salaam, University of Ghana, and the places like these, University of Khartoum in Sudan, they were not incentivized to leave the country. They were actually secured in their job, and they were doing good work, and they felt like they don't need to migrate to continue doing their research and to be productive and to advance in their careers. So during that time, there was a lot of investment in African education institutes, to the point that an African scholar would not feel a big difference that will urge them or will push them to think about migrating. That changed, of course, and we might think, and we can try to basically bring that back. Through economic development, you can give people a reason to stay or return. That's doubtless the most effective policy, and we've seen some of them right now. There are some policies that encourage African high skills to come back, either start a business or to rejoin the industry within their home countries or within the continent in general. And if we can have more of that, then we would have 6 Rs quite effectively. Next slide. I think I have like 2 or 3 minutes, so I'll try to go quickly. But Anne, you can let me know. I would like to go through some case studies from Africa. In Rwanda, they adopted an internationally accepted best practices and invested in information technology. So they can meet they also increased or they enhanced the capacity of the TVET to meet the demands of the labor market. And now to become a hub of technology innovation in sub-Saharan Africa. So they have been able to recruit many Africans to stay within the continent, although they might be migrating or leaving their home country, but not surprisingly, they maintain a link with their home countries when they're closer in proximity, and they do projects and stuff like that, collaborations with Rwanda and with other African countries. In Ethiopia, the issuance of the yellow cards, which are, a process or recognizing the diaspora and giving them more advantages so they can invest in the country, even if they don't have, Ethiopian papers. So they get some special treatment, and it has ripened some fruit. In Nigeria, there is a well-developed diaspora. We mentioned that, the Nigerians are highly educated, or the university educated are probably the most educated in migrants in the US, according to census. And that's, since 2004 or something. I'm trying to remember the exact, but all right. So in the discussion, what we have is that there are two things that can be learned from the situation and the literature, that the African brain drain overall works against the development agenda of the continent. We don't mean that the skill level migration itself is a bad thing. We mean that the way it is set up now, the way the things that are happening right now are working against the development agenda of the continent. It can change. What we are saying is that we don't want to stop, halt the whole phenomenon, but we want to make it work for Africa. So that's one thing. The other thing is that that the measures can be taken to address it. We know that it can change because we've seen other countries do it. So that's these are the two things. We need to change it because now it's not working for our benefit, and it can be changed. So the conditions in African countries in general are a different story from South Asia, China, or Mexico. However, we can have lessons. We can learn from their best practices and adapt them and try to modify them to fit our situations. For example, that the R&D collaboration between the diaspora and homeland Africans can be made more occurring than they are now. And there are windows of return. And that's not a far-fetched idea, because according to the International Migration Report by the UN, 25 million documented international migrants were residing in Africa in 2017, accounting for about 2% of the total population of the continent. And between 2000 and 2017, migration to Africa increased by an average of 3% per annum. So migration towards Africa, it's actually happening. And that's because opportunities are now more in Africa, and there are, there is more to do in Africa now than before. And so some of that, migration, not necessarily all, because we also need other people from other parts of the world to come to Africa. We need that aspect of exchange, but we need more Africans to return. And it's not a far-fetched idea, as the report says. Next slide. So I'll go with conclusions and recommendations. 4 conclusions, 4 recommendations. In terms of conclusions, the global phenomenon of human mobility access across borders and seas for visiting, working, and learning is overall an impressive feature of modernity. For STI systems, it is highly valuable when different minds from around the world have access to each other. Immigrants from Africa and developing countries contribute significantly to technological progress and innovation in the OECD countries. And however, the phenomenon as it is now, as it stands, is negative in Africa. It has a negative impact. African STI systems are left continuously disadvantaged by brain drain, and that needs to change. For recommendations, we need to address brain drain needs at national and regional levels through accurate, relevant data and evidence-informed policies. We also need to explore and utilize the 6R approaches, including regulations, incentives, targeted programs, and soft instruments. We need to facilitate and encourage collaboration between scientists, engineers, researchers of the African diaspora and those at home continent. And we need to improve regulatory aspects that help us with what we said above, such as dual citizenships, investments, and SME startup incentives. Next slide. I'm just like, if the presentation is going to be shared by some people, I actually recommend, and hopefully Becky mentioned that because the book will be available soon, and it is going to be free. So I really hope that people will read the chapter and get more details and get in depth of the discussion and what we mentioned there in terms of information and discussions and approaches and perspectives. However, these are the references, the main references that we're using this presentation. Next slide. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Gussai. I can see somebody has raised a hand, but I recommend we keep all the questions until the end of the presentation. So can we have Agnes now making her contribution, responding to Gussai's presentation. And Agnes, are you ready?
Okay, so I'll go ahead with my contribution. Thank you, everyone online, and thank you so much, Gussai, for your presentation. And it's also quite a pleasure for me to get to contribute and make comments just after your presentation. Quite an honor. So I'll just go right into my own work. This was just a reflection from what Gussai has presented, and my question, I had a whole lot of questions. Generally, what do we see as the effect of brain drain on economic development generally? And I asked this question from a broader angle, looking at the knowledge economy, for instance. If we have to talk about knowledge economy for these developing countries, or for Kenya, for instance, citing that as a case, one might argue then that brain drain has negatively impacted science and innovation, and largely, of course, socio-economic growth and development. And this will be generally, of course, Gussai has already highlighted on that. That will be generally because the human capital that is needed for the industries, higher education institutions, the health sectors, for poverty alleviation, year in, year out, tend to erode through brain drain. And then my comment on brain drain in relation to higher education, then I ask a question on, there is that assumption that in the literature that the more a population is trained through higher education, the more then you will improve the innovation of a country, the more then there's the socio-economic growth of a particular country. However, if you reflect this in the context of brain drain, then there tends to be, I would argue to some extent really, that they tend to be negative effects, like you produce and then there is a leakage. If you look at it, you produce today 10 PhDs, then they leak 8 of them, like leak tomorrow, and you're left at with 2 of them. And that is, I think, something that Gussai indicated in his presentation, where you train a whole lot, and it's quite expensive training these individuals, researchers, health professionals rather, engineers. And after training them, they tend to leak through the system. Then the question will be then, how does this then increase the innovation that you would argue that it needs to be increased? Then I talk about brain drain on research performance in particular, and I argue that there's a need to restore African research and research institutions that need strategies that focus on institutional building and not just capacity building. Capacity building is important. However, it has to be embedded in a framework of building institutions of science and innovation in Africa. And if speaking of institution building, then I would argue that there's need of effective and efficient institutions. How are African countries able to look at issues of governance, for instance? Are there sufficient tools of measuring and comparing performance, for instance, in these institutions? Do these African institutions have sufficient frameworks to support higher learning institutions or research institutions when it comes to research, for instance? And then my question just in regard to that then is, can African countries translate higher education regardless of what they are facing currently to higher innovation activity? Can this then be done by integrating the skilled migration that to some extent they would have contributed to training them, and to other extent, no, because some of these individuals tend to be trained out of the country. My comment on brain drain and STI or R&D, I ask a question: what is the effect of the low numbers on human capacity? And this is in particular to STEM, to the social economic development of the African nations. We've had initially, there's a mention of human capacity gaps in STEM, which has already effects on the growth of nations. There are minimal human resources to engage in research and development needs. However, there's a part, as we've seen, and as you would understand, there's always the dialogue that what then is the role of the social sciences when it comes to the growth of a nation. And that brings me to the question I ask myself at this point. I mean, if you have to argue that social sciences would have a role to also play in economic growth, then what do they receive as social scientists? Do they receive sufficient funding to support R&D as well? And we can have that debate and compare funding between STEM and funding between social sciences, and compare the productivity between STEM and productivity between the social sciences. In today's discussion, there was a very important point where Gussai mentioned that 80% of Africa, and that's a previous research that was conducted by CREST actually, where the study found that 80% of African researchers want to leave their countries for abroad. During the study, there are quite a number of reasons really that were mentioned by the African researchers who were interviewed. They mentioned reasons such as lack of research funding, poor facilities, poor intellectual stimulation in their own countries or in the institutions, threat of violence, lack of opportunities for career advancement and employment. And I mean, for some other individuals who had already left the country or still even in their countries, they would indicate things like lack of good education for their children or for within their own country. And sometimes there were reasons like joining their own families. And that would imply if, let's say, your spouse is in the US studying, then you who is working in Kenya as a lecturer, you might join it. And that's how many of those individuals join their spouse and their children abroad. So my argument is that African governments have to provide world-class education and training opportunities, resources, funds, and policies needed to retain their researchers. But then the question is, how feasible is this suggestion in reality? And I ask that question in the context of some of the challenges that face the science systems or higher education institutions. The governments, I mean, for you to have sufficient resources, you need to already be investing sufficient amounts of GDP into R&D. I mean, if we have to start that discussion, and then is that the case at the moment? Hence my question, how feasible is this? And then can the graduates who attain advanced and expensive skills return home where such skills and resources are not available? I mean, Gussai mentioned a whole lot of incentives that can be put in place, but then still the question would be, how feasible is this? And that just brings me to my next comment on retention. And I think I've already asked that question. Does the African nations have education policies? And that will be within higher education and TVET that will enable creation of human resources for innovation and retain them. I mean, it's one other thing to train these scientists, train these researchers, train these nurses, train these health professionals. But it's another thing to provide sufficient or conducive environments rather, for them to be able to produce knowledge, share knowledge, or contribute to, I mean, speaking of health professionals, be able to improve the health conditions of the population. And of course, a healthy population, then you have, then that will definitely contribute to the economic growth. So the question is, how feasible is this? I mean, Gussai mentioned examples of Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, when it comes to these responses. But this is a question I'm asking for Africa in general, and maybe bring in the specific example case of Kenya. How feasible is this, and how are the policies in place to enable this? I make some comment on return, and I still ask quite a number of questions when I'm making this comment. What are the policies, what are the working conditions for researchers and academics and other workers to return home and contribute to the innovation of these countries? Are the incentives for the migrants to return to home countries sufficient to override the limitations at home? I mean, we can say, okay, we can put in place sufficient salaries. But then if you look at the literature on incentives, monetary incentives are normally they have a time lapse. So it's something that would you will be happy at. It's a very momentary thing. So if you said, okay, looking at incentives and remuneration, for instance, in one of the Kenyan studies we did, if you say, okay, let's increase the incentives for the academics, there's more to it. There's more reasons to why these academics or these researchers or these health professionals tend to leave these countries for abroad. There are other non-incentives, non-monetary incentives, for instance, the social environments, the political environments. I mean, as a young researcher, you can convince Agnes to come back home, but there's a particular point in time where the monetary aspect won't be a pull factor. So then it's very important that as the governments look at the monetary incentives, for instance, there's more that is supposed to be put in place. The socio-political environments as well need to be very incentivizing for these academics to be able, or these researchers or health professionals to be able to come back home and contribute to the productivity, research productivity, and also contribute to a healthy population. Yeah, and I make the comment that some developing countries have made significant investments in infrastructure for sure, and education, but have not achieved the scientific development, technological innovative capability, either to retain or recover the human capital they have generated. I mean, this is counterproductive to some extent. You like I mentioned already, you would produce this X number of students, PhD graduates rather at the end of 2020. There's a question, are you able to retain them? And if they were in other countries, are you able to have sufficient incentives for them? And so I asked the question, can the loss of the human capital be justified to some extent? Should countries make additional investment in science and technology and produce innovations that will reduce the loss and lead to conversion? I mean, this is a question that we can get to discuss about later on. Then there is a comment I make on remittances, and this is a comment that is I'm very much aware during the discussion Gussai made, that when you look at the input and output and of, let's say, when you are training a doctor, it's quite very expensive and they leave the country. But then there is a question that at the end of the day, the 100, let me give a realistic figure, 20,000, let's say 20,000 doctors who are out of this country, they remit some amount of money back to this country. I do agree that the amount might not be in measure to the input that was put in for them to be trained. However, I would still ask the question then, can a small percentage of the multi-million dollars remitted home by the immigrants be invested in R&D? Might this improve the opportunities for the highly skilled and educated individuals at home? I mean, if this amount goes back to higher education or R&D, will this be good for the economic development? However, there is a very important question that I ask, that is, do the government have tools and policies to track these remittances? And I ask this from an experience point of view, where let's take the instance of Kenya, where a whole lot of money will be remitted, but does the government follow up, and do they even know how much for sure is remitted in per annum? I mean, they can only estimate, but how much leaks into the economy without being taxed and without them knowing how the money comes in? And Kenya has a whole lot of many ways that this money can be remitted. I mean, maybe they can follow up. It's just currently that we have very limited tax on M-Pesa, or very limited money on from the banks. But still, the question, despite the argument that there's remittances cannot measure the training amount that was used, can this amount go into R&D? And I'll quickly comment on the collaboration aspect. And I ask the question, I mean, this was answered somehow, but we can still reflect on it. What are the factors that can enable more collaboration between the diaspora and the homeland? And this was just a reflection I was having. We talk of collaboration, but this collaboration, if you have to look at the dynamics of collaboration of African researchers, for instance, and this tends to be, there is a very strong international collaboration between in Africa. I mean, a recent study that I did shows that at least for Kenya, for instance, between 70 to 75% of the collaborations are international. But then you have to ask you one question: what really influences this? Mainly, then it will be funding, for instance. So, in as much as you have to talk about collaboration, then you have to ask the question, what's the role of research funding in the diaspora and homeland collaborations, for instance? And then the final thing that I will talk about collaboration, it's really in relation to a brain drain and the foreign scientists, foreign expatriate scientists from developing countries who are involved in R&D have more productive capacity. That is in terms of publications and patents as compared to the scientists in their home countries. And of course, this can be explained by the favorable context and conditions that that enable science and technology to prosper. But there is the important question, then can these expatriate scientists, academics, and health professionals contribute to their knowledge and clinical and research skills in their native countries by developing collaborative training programs, research projects, and teaching of those in their own home countries? How feasible is this for the different countries? Then this cannot happen if this has to be very reciprocal role in the home countries and then from the end of the foreign scientists. There's a question: how possible is this? How feasible is this? Are there policies? Are there conditions to allow these joint programs to happen, for instance, or these training programs to happen? And then this still cannot happen. The foreign scientists, for instance, academics, health professionals are not going to do this alone. There's need of other stakeholders to come on board, scientists, political leaders, and other decision makers as well. But there is another important aspect of technology that can be used by both the health professionals and as well scientists to be able to share knowledge as well. And I mentioned Supercourse, for instance, which has hundreds and hundreds of courses. Then my question is, can they be used by these expatriates to share knowledge in their own countries? I should be able to be finishing. Yeah, and I just quickly comment, and this was this slide was influenced by one of the questions that I had already been asked earlier on. What are the lessons that for Africa, for instance, can learn from the cases of Asian countries? And I give an example of China, for instance, which is a scientific leader in biological research, and particularly the Human Genome Project. And the question was, what has Asia, for instance, or China in this instance, done differently? And I mentioned instances where there's been a contribution of mainly by the foreign expatriate, that is from the literature shows that the foreign expatriate citizens have been able to develop research skills needed by their native countries. But then there's been a whole lot of incentives for for the researchers and academics. But then there is just a very important aspect of investment in higher education, and this can be drawn from the knowledge economy literature, for instance, what the Asian tigers have done when it comes to their higher education generally. Yeah. And so to conclude, and just that this is drawn generally from the comment, the discussions made by Gussai, and I just say that the immigrant scientists are recoverable assets who can play a role in developing opportunities. I mean, I remember his comment saying that it's not, returning home is not really a far-fetched idea.
Can we request the participants to mute your mics, please?
Okay,
continue,
so
Agnes, continue.
Yeah, let me just finish on this. Recovery requires, I argue that, and that is in the initial discussion as well, recovery requires diverse and creative channels, support of the scientists to contribute to innovation and economic growth. Then, as I said initially, foreign citizen expatriates can develop innovative graduate education opportunities at home and technology as well that can be transferred to national development areas. But the question is, how feasible is this? I mean, looking at the dynamics, let's say, for instance, how even is it, for instance, just Kenyatta University that is here and Nairobi University for a joint program to be conducted, for instance? Hence my question, how feasible is this? And there is lastly just the argument that skilled immigrants involving them in creating opportunities will encourage, to some extent really, retention of skills and brain exchange. But at some point really there is, apart from brain drain, I'll finish by saying that there is the argument that there is that argument of us talking about brain exchange and brain circulation and just not brain drain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agnes. I think that was a good response to the presentation by Gussai. It would be impossible for me to summarize what has been shared this far, but I think there are some recurring consensus between the two of you that brain drain somehow negatively impacts Africa's economic development. I think that has been recurring in your discussion. And I think there are quite a number of suggested recommendations and suggestions on how this can be addressed, because it seems like it's not something which we have any control over. But what I hear you saying, both of you, is that we can tap into this particular, issue. We can tap into what can come out of the BD, brain drain. And collaboration has been coming out very clearly, like it's something that we need to enhance, collaboration. But it seems like it's not something which is as straightforward as it seems. And therefore, there were some questions that Agnes, you are asking, the questions that you posed, which are quite relevant. And I think those are questions that we can focus on in our discussion. And a number of the questions which are being posted on the chat basically are looking at some of those issues that have to do with how do we enhance collaboration. So the structures for supporting collaboration is probably something that we need to think about. The issue of policy, how can policy and policy action, how can it help? Particularly in ensuring that we retain, the retaining the skills that are built, within Africa, to avoid, this kind of, a pipe that is leaking, training, and then you don't see where the skills that you are building, where they are going. So policy and policy action, that's something which has come up. Then there was also the issue of focusing on holistic, addressing the issue holistically and focus much more on institutional strengthening. And of course, policies is part of that institutional strengthening. And then there was the question of human skills. So we are building human skills, but this particular case, we are building human skills for innovation. And I think around that, there were some questions around whether it is skills for STEM or skills for social scientists. So there are quite a number of issues that are coming up, and I know many of you have been taking note, going by what I can see from the chat. So perhaps then we should open up the floor for a discussion. And as we wait to see whether somebody would be raising their hands, you can actually raise your hand. There was a hand which had been raised, but I think it has been put down already. So as we wait for that, then we could look at some of the questions from the chat. We appreciate those who have been able to post those questions. Maybe randomly I can select quite a number, maybe 3 at once, and then I can request the 2 speakers to respond, if that is okay with you. So the first question which I see on the chat, and I think that question came in before the webinar, before this webinar, has to do with what is the role of AfricaRICS? Because the main agenda for this webinar series is to focus on how do we rebuild capacity on innovation and development within Africa. How does the future look like? So somebody was asking, from the innovation system thinking, learning and competence building are enhanced by the nature of the linkages that are among the systems, are coming from among the system actors. So the question was, how can collaborations be enhanced within the STI system actors? And how can these collaborations be made to benefit, the benefit, how can the brain drain be made to benefit the system in general? And I think this is some of these questions were posed by Agnes, and it would be nice for us to perhaps think about that a little bit more and hear what the other audience, the other people who have joined have to say about it. That is one of the questions. Then there was another question which talks about what kind of evidence is needed to inform policy action. And I think that question was also alluded to a little bit by Agnes and as well as by Gussai. And then the other question relates to retention through education sector policies, which seems to be the best option. So should we recommend an overhaul of the policies, or are there windows of opportunity or entry points for initiating a conversation among the stakeholders? Maybe we can focus on those 3 questions for now, and then we can pick 3 more in the next round. Would you want to go first, Gussai?
Okay. We'll go with the first question. What is the role of AfricaRICS? Right, that's the first question. I think AfricaRICS can have a big role in making the African scholars who are within their network able to be productive and relevant globally while still being in Africa. So if they are able to be productive and relevant while still working within Africa, that would contribute to retention, which is, in my opinion, one of the best approaches in the 6 Rs. If not, maybe on the second to return. And so yeah, AfricaRICS, I think AfricaRICS is kind of doing some of that already. And what we would say then is more of that. We need more of that. Now, I'm just trying to keep it brief, because there's a whole discussion that we can have along that line. The second question is, how can collaboration be enhanced within the STI system actors? and to the benefit of African development agenda, or to the system in general. I mean, that's quite a big question, and I think we addressed, both Agnes and I addressed it in a way. But if I can add anything additional briefly, is that we need to also engage not just the African universities. I would say that there are actually there is more than one African institutes or actors that host scholars. There are universities, of course, that's a big one. There are also RTOs, or research and technology organizations. These guys are very important, and they play a different role in the STI system than universities. For example, in Kenya, you have Kirdi. In Tanzania, we have Tirdo, Kamatek. These are institutes, they're globally called RTOs. There is a cumulated evidence that in the countries that, the newly industrialized countries, in Malaysia, Singapore, the Asian Tigers, these RTOs played a key role in advancing and pushing the industrialization of their countries. So they have a big role to play within the African STI systems as well. So to enhance collaboration is to also think outside direct academia. Let's include RTOs, let's include centers of excellence, and let's include, of course, think tanks, such as AGS, such as TIPRO. They are very important, and we know that because when we look at other countries or other that we're able to industrialize and advance technologically, think tanks as well as centers of excellence and RTOs and universities, all these actors play the role, and they play different roles. So they're not one of them cancels the others. So the existence of one of them at an efficiency does not mean that the other ones are not needed. They're all needed. So that is my response. And then the last question is retention through education sector policies. Yeah. So how can we initiate a conversation among stakeholders? I think, such as this webinar, for example, this is a good initiation. The stakeholders are many, and I know, for example, that Anne is currently working on a project that would actually contribute to that within Kenya. And we are working as well as TIPRO in something in the East African engineering education and linking to industries. So I think all of these kind of projects in that kind of thinking, that line of thinking, would contribute to having a fruitful and rich conversation that would hopefully result in some work. I would like to just briefly say something about something that Agnes mentioned, and I think that was really important. I thank her for that. I did not get the chance to actually talk about it more in my presentation, but I'm glad that she mentioned it, which is the other non-monetary and non-research incentives for diaspora to return. Socio-political environment, prospects, family, etc. That's important. And we know it's important because other countries have played and banked on it, and it worked. So yeah, that's good to mention and to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Gussai. I think, Agnes, let me give you an opportunity after a question which is going to be asked, two questions which Kevin had actually posted beforehand. He can ask, but before Kevin comes in, I think there's a very key question that has been posted on the chat, and I think we don't want to lose an opportunity to discuss it. It's on TVETs. And I think, Agnes, you alluded to the role of TVETs, and it would be nice for us to have a conversation on that. It's on the chat from Becky. It talks about the TVETs as a focus and versus the focus on higher education for skills is something that we need to think about. Can we have high productivity growth by training through TVETs as opposed to the universities? And does the TVET institutions allow for more inclusive innovation opportunities? I think that's a big question for us to discuss. And I know, Gussai, perhaps you may have something to say about this, because Agnes alluded to this. So if you have anything to say about this, it would be nice. But it would be nice for the audience also to contribute to this particular topic. If there is somebody in the audience who could have some more information on how this particular question can be answered. Gussai, as we wait for any volunteer, the audience.
Okay, you want me to respond to that, to the TVET one?
Yes, okay. As we wait to see whether there's somebody who may want to contribute to that.
All
yes.
Right. And of course, and you can stop me at any point. Yes, when I mentioned universities, I should take that back. I should have said educational or training institutes. We usually kind of say universities in general, and I understand that sometimes takes TVETs out of the picture. But what I would say is that training institutes, tech training or polytech training, polytechnic institutes in general, whether they are higher education or at the level of TVET. Because we also know that in order for engineers to actually have an impact in society, you need, according to studies since 2010, one of them is a big project by UNESCO, a big report by UNESCO, on that you need, in front of each engineer, you need like 10 technologists and technicians. And by engineer, I mean here a certified, professional engineer that is, as defined by legalities and responsibilities of design and accountability for designs and stuff like that. You always need technologists and technicians more than that engineer. And that is a role of TVET and polytechnic institutes. And that can be treated as one line. Like when you start from TVET, it goes all the way to the PhD level. And by that I mean, and I know that in some countries they actually have that kind of progress line. So we should not differentiate or have a divide, a rigid divide between starting from the level of TVET until the level of PhD. It should be a continuous process and a continuous aspiration for capacity increasement or even for career enhancement or whatever. It can start from the TVET level. So yeah, TVETs are quite important.
Yeah, thank you, Gussai. I know an essay from Nairobi University. I think you do have some contribution to make. Maybe you can go ahead as then we can have Kelvin. But you, Anne. Anne, I see you have raised your hand.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so thank you, Gussai, for the presentation. I think there's an ecosystem between the university and the TVET, but they don't train the same things. Even this, the level of entry is a bit different. Yeah, so for the TVET, what they train is the basic level of the basic entry level of, if you are an engineer, what more like the technical component of how they can help the engineers do something. Like you see the road construction, the engineer is there and the people on the ground, maybe those ones are the ones who are trained in the TVET. So we cannot say that we could put them at the same level. I think we need to categorize them and put them where they belong, because the university training, maybe for an engineer, is quite, I think it's quite more advanced at that level. So let's separate the two trainings and look at what is their role in the society. Yeah, so let's put the role of the TVET people where they can do, and let's put the role of the engineer in the society where they can be, because they are trained, their curriculum is quite different. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We may not discuss that a little bit more, because you are actually raising more questions than answers, but we may not be able to discuss that now because of time. But we have noted that answer, and I'm sure we will keep the conversation going even after this. But I want to give Kelvin a chance. Kevin, are you still there? to ask your 2 questions which you had sent. Could you please choose just 1 question because of time, so that we can conclude? Alvin. Is Kelvin there? So perhaps maybe it's good for me to ask for him the question he had asked. Why is Africa still economically and technologically stagnated? I think that was the question which he had asked. And he has argued that we have exported a lot of skills for students to study abroad in order for them to actually learn new ideas so that we can use them to transform our economies. But still we are struggling in this area. What has Asia done and Africa has not done? I think that was one of the questions he had asked. I would ask Rajesh. I know Rajesh, you are you are listening. Would you maybe want to comment on that? Because I think you have done some research in this particular area. Rajesh. We seem not to have Rajesh, but is there anybody who can answer that question? Because I think Kelvin may have dropped that question, and why we are not doing well, and why other countries. Is there something that we can learn from China, from Asia, to be able to enhance, getting back that's what we are calling brain gain. Anybody who has any comment on that? Peter, do you have any comment on that? Maybe responding to those to that particular question. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks so much, Anne, and thanks so much, everyone, for today's session. So mine is, let me take an example of engineering course. A University of Nairobi trains an engineer, but then you have Mombasa Road being built, and you have Chinese coming from China to build our roads. So probably an area we are not doing so well is engaging our graduates or the researchers or people in the innovation sector in terms of getting hands-on and giving them opportunities when they arise in our local countries or continents. So I think that that area we are not doing so well. So that's my contribution. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Peter. So I think because of time, I can see quite a number of questions which have been posted. Many of them have been addressed. I can see the question from Sama. It has to do with the discussion that was going on. The reason why there's a brain drain is much more than just economic and monetary. She's talking about quite a number of reasons why people are moving from Algeria to other countries. So we tend to agree with what you have put on the chat, Sama. This question by Martin: has the scaling of digital learning overcome some of the challenges posed by brain drain? And can national innovation systems tap into such positive implication? I think Agnes tried to answer that question a little bit, but I think that can be combined with the question that I've seen on COVID. The challenge we are having with COVID, would it be seen as an opportunity for solving the problem that we are having? I think that question had been raised on the chat. I had seen it. So, and we may not be able to actually address some of these questions which are coming up because of time, but I would encourage us to continue, engaging, through email, through social media, because we do have a platform where we can engage on some of these issues. And therefore, because of time, I would ask Agnes and Gussai, just reflecting on some of the questions which are on the chat, could you make a final, comments, final take home messages, 1 minute each before we conclude? So we can start with Agnes, who has not talked, and then we can go to Gussai.
And thank you so much. This will be my conclusions or concluding comments. When it comes to Africa, for instance, or most of the African countries, there's a whole lot, and that would answer the question on stagnation. There's still a lot of training that is supposed to happen when it comes to through higher education training, their PhDs, through the TVET training, all the skilled workers that would allow an economy to be self-reliant despite the salary employment, for instance. So that's very important, one. Two, I wanted to make a comment on the digital aspects of learning. And these are strategies that I think, and I would quickly comment on the COVID question. I mean, the African nations, or just nations generally, looking at brain drain, what is needed to be done is that there's a whole lot of courses of technology as tools that can be used whether by nurses or whether by health professionals generally, or academics, to be able to offer courses. And that, I think, when the question on Africa Leaks was asked, and I might be right or wrong, but I think that is where Africa Leaks can actually come in, use their networks and be able to use this distance learning strategies, for instance. So those will be my final comments. Thank you so much for listening.
And over to you, Gussai.
Okay, thank you all for listening, and I hope that this was a fruitful event and informative as well. I would say that only recently we started to talk about the issue that we addressed today, brain drain head-on. It's surprisingly, we have talked about it a lot, in the recent years, but we haven't addressed it head-on. And only recently we've started to do that. And that's a good thing, because now when we acknowledge the problem at that level, then we can start to actually do something measurable about it. So I would invite whoever attended today to see the longer version of the argument and the literature review on this issue, to anticipate the upcoming book, the edited volume, Building Science Systems in Africa, Conceptual Foundations and Empirical Considerations. And of course, the chapter is Skills for Science Systems in Africa, but the book itself, I believe, has a lot of many valuable contributions. And so it should be available soon, and it's going to be available online for free. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes and Gussai, for your presentations. I think there's so much that we didn't capture because of time. There's never enough time, but I think there are some take-home messages for all of us, and we have been invited to keep watching the space for the full chapter that is coming very soon. But also to think about how do we reverse the flow of skills, and talents, from the south to the north, and cause the reverse to happen from north now to south, so that we could have the skills contributing to the African continent development. So with that parting shot, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And we look forward to seeing you soon in the upcoming webinars. Thank you.